Well, I'll try and be brief. I was reflecting on the last day and a half and thinking about the practical elements, the applied pieces. I spend a lot of my time working at the local community level with mayors, with cities around the world, with civil society organizations. And in many ways, while there's, I think, some pessimism about the sort of national or federal policy, the macroeconomics that we still need to attend to, at the local level, there is a cause for cautious optimism. And I say this because I've seen this movement building for some time, Reverend Barber and others included, but a recognition, I think, of all of the themes that we've heard across the 2 days is building up at many levels locally, and I think it has showing some great promise. So I thought I'd just reflect a little bit on some of those promise points, but also areas of risk and where we've seen some action taking hold. One of the things that's nice about working at the local level in the age of data democratization and technological advances is that communities can kind of bypass nation states in many ways in terms of connecting lessons learned and insights. From stakeholder to stakeholder, from community leader to community leader. And I think that's what we're seeing locally. But one caution I will also offer is that as we talk about civil society organizations, one of the risks that I see in kind of the centering of who has voice and power, civil society organizations are not a monolith. And in many cases, government agencies often pick up a few of those civil society organizations to partner with, often missing the larger representation, often missing the larger voice of the people that are most impacted and affected. And that's a caution that I will offer in my remarks. A lot of my experiences that I'll reflect on are based in the US, both in rural and urban environments, but there's a lot of transferability to other settings. And these conversations, as I said, have been global. So there's a convergence of 3 threads that I think are useful and have been spoken about, but are worth underscoring, that are pushing civil society organizations and community control in these conversations. First, kind of our overarching reflections in the charter that we talked about at the outset, this concept of justice, a different kind of reckoning around structural racism and historical marginalization is taking hold. It doesn't mean that conversations about reparations policy will be successful in the US, as those who know that policy, but there is deeper conversation about correction and reparation. And through the positive aspects of social media and data democratization, organizations that we've worked with, like One Fair Wage, have started to look at not just economic inequity based on the wage implications, but really looking at it as the value that we place on workers and a quality of life. We've spent a lot of time talking about youth in the last 2 days. That has been a promising trend during COVID-19, when school doors were shuttered because of the pandemic. Youth serving organizations really rallied to connect young people who mobilized on everything from poverty and voting rights to environmental racism and reproductive justice. And so there are organizations all across the US, El Pueblo in North Carolina, Youth Serve in Birmingham, Alabama, Urban Underground in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where youth leaders are not just kind of activated, but are fundamentally learning the tools and the science of policy in order to become stronger policy influencers in a way that they can now because of technology and because of some of these local movements. Second, one of the risks of the conversations that we've been having over the last couple of days is sometimes people pit problems against each other. That's an unfortunate underbelly of the discussion. But what I've seen in terms of promise is that civil society organizations are tying these pieces together in new ways. In many ways, they were quite siloed and segregated maybe 5 years ago, but they're now linking poverty with environmental racism. There's stronger narrative about the links with mental health and despair. It's not a matter of if your community is going to be affected by climate-induced disaster. It's really about when. And so that conversation has been an entry point to then have conversations about poverty mitigation. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is an interesting community of transformation after the industrial age in that part of the country, you're starting to see conversations about climate and inland flooding that have now turned into pilot tests of universal basic income. And so it's activated a deeper conversation about disaster resilience and housing affordability. And quite frankly, youth particularly, but civil society organizations are now talking about malaise and social disconnection in a way that we haven't seen before. And that is, providing a foundation. So as trust in government has fallen, particularly in the US, but in many ways globally, there's been a rise in trust in civil society organizations that can be leveraged. And so even in surveys that we and others have done, more than 80% of respondents, particularly those from low and lower income backgrounds, were connected to civil society organizations in a way that they hadn't before, not only for often what is thought of as their own basic needs, but really as a means of organizing and of reflection. And so those are promising points. Again, the risk is that we bifurcate or we segregate these concepts and these issues, and that we don't place community voice at the center. And what we've seen as the foundation of what has worked is actually probably a through line of the meeting presentations over the last 2 days, which is a tying around a shared narrative, which I heard in Reverend Barber's conversation. It was reflected in this draft that Professor Sachs put together. There is a conversation about values happening that is not divorced from the conversation about data and measures. So even as you heard about the research yesterday, that is coming into closer harmony than I've ever observed before. So first on narrative, the economic inequity story has been there for some time, but it has been starting to move to a conversation that hasn't centered just the economy, but one that centers well-being and puts economic opportunity as a critical dimension, but not the only dimension. So as researchers talk about the multidimensional sort of elements of poverty, you're seeing that play out locally. Many of the states might be aware of the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, who has put forth a dignity economy, Mayor Lumumba, a different Lumumba, of course. And that has really rebalanced the idea of economic opportunity with a healthy citizenry, a thriving educational system, and inclusion and belonging. It's been quite appealing to organizations like the Just Economy Institute that are trying to reimagine the standards of business around new paradigms and economy. So there is an idea now that is about more collective benefit and community, not simply individual wealth models. Now, of course, it's not easy. And the second piece of that is the measurement. And so as much as we love the OECD reflections on subjective well-being and tying economic outputs to factors like mental health, when you raise that with local organizations and civil society groups, they say yes, and quite frankly, because it misses dimensions of justice. It does not go upstream enough in terms of capturing structural and historical inequities, capturing chronic and cumulative trauma, a term we use to kind of co-opt individual allostatic load, community allostatic load. What does it mean to be beaten back and marginalized over decades, if not centuries? And what does that look like? And then how do we think about civic well-being? There's a concept that some of my colleagues and I have been positing that should be a companion to GDP, which is the GDP2, the gross developmental potential, which really builds on, Sen, Amartya Sen, and others, which is how do we capture that investment in human potential at the youngest ages? We've talked about education and social connection. How are we actually measuring that? So as much as we've made progress on measures of well-being and more multidimensional measures of poverty, we're still missing those investments and those justice dimensions. And then finally, we've talked a lot about policy instruments, and that's critical here. But what we've seen locally is the need to transform governance structures locally that don't just consult civil society actors, but place them meaningfully in partnership in policy design and implementation. Otherwise, we have that question of whose knowledge is privileged, and we recreate the same old. And so we've seen some communities tie municipal revenue plans to shared well-being metrics. City governments, at least in the US, actually have to balance their budgets, unlike the federal budget. So there is a process that can be structured. It's not perfect. We're seeing people think about participatory budgeting, where community leaders really lead decision-making, and the roots of kindness-based policy that really elevate altruistic intent or collective benefit. So it doesn't mean to say that we've got it solved at the local level. There are entrenched political and social structures that really are seeking to thwart this, including some in academic institutions. But I do see civil society organizations really working hand in glove with government in some communities to talk about human potential and not just economic growth and opportunity. So thanks.
Very good.